Judge gives 12-year-old life without parole for killing twin sister with poison. 12 years old. That was her age when she walked into that courtroom with a quiet smile. A smile that shouldn't have existed. Her twin sister lay in a grave and she felt nothing. No tears, no remorse. Just an eerie calm, as if the most calculated plan of her young life had gone exactly as intended. The judge watched her feet dangle above the courtroom floor, swinging slightly, and he realized something terrifying. Childhood had not protected her from understanding death. It had simply made her crime more unfathomable. What happened in that suburban home wasn't a tragedy. It was something far darker. And as the evidence unfolded, the courtroom would discover that this wasn't an impulse. It was planned, deliberate, and absolutely unforgivable. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way, even when it breaks our hearts in the process. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and share your thoughts below about what you'll hear today. This is how it all began. In a quiet suburb where nothing seemed unusual, two girls shared everything: a bedroom, a birthday, a bloodline. They looked identical in every physical way, but their souls were oceans apart. One was gentle, anxious, always seeking approval. The other was different. She was sharp, calculating, quietly resentful of anyone who stood in her way. Their mother often said they were like night and day trapped in matching bodies. She didn't realize how literally true that would become. She didn't know that one of her daughters had already begun researching something dark on her tablet late at night, after the house had gone silent. She didn't know that in less than 72 hours, everything would change forever. The poisoning would be perfect, untraceable, the kind of crime that should have been called an accident. But it wasn't an accident, and the evidence would prove it. The courtroom was silent in a way that silence shouldn't exist. Every breath felt observed. Every heartbeat seemed audible. And at the center of this suffocating quiet sat a 12-year-old girl in a pale blue dress, her legs swinging gently because her feet didn't reach the floor. Her name would become synonymous with a legal precedent that no parent ever wanted to imagine. First-degree murder, premeditated homicide, and the victim was her identical twin sister. She sat there with something almost resembling composure, her small hands folded in her lap, occasionally glancing sideways with an expression that could only be described as mild annoyance. The judge entered, and everyone rose except the weight of what they all knew kept them bent inward. This was not a case about childhood mistakes or sibling rivalry taken too far. This was about a calculation so cold, so deliberate, that it had demanded an adult trial for a girl who still fit in children's clothing sizes. The prosecutor stood slowly, papers organized with the precision of someone about to dismantle an entire defense based on forensic inevitability. First-degree murder required intent, malice aforethought, and planning. Accidents didn't leave search histories. Accidents didn't involve household poisons, carefully measured and disguised in an evening drink. The defense attorney sat rigid, already knowing that the evidence had no mercy, no room for reasonable doubt, and absolutely no sympathy for the defendant's age. The surviving twin had done something that transcended every excuse childhood could offer. She had understood death, she had researched it, and she had delivered it with the precision of someone far older than her years. The judge's eyes found her again, and what he saw was not a confused child overwhelmed by her own actions. What he saw was someone who had wanted this outcome, someone who had made a choice. The courtroom had been designed for adult crimes, adult juries, adult consequences. But on this particular morning, it held something that didn't fit any of those categories. A child who had committed a crime that shattered every assumption about what a 12-year-old was capable of understanding. She wore a small crucifix around her neck, a detail the photographers would obsess over later. The jury filed in slowly, 12 people who had already been briefed on what they would hear, already understanding that their job was not to sympathize, but to find truth. They looked at her, and most of them immediately looked away. It's difficult to maintain eye contact with something that represents a fundamental failure of childhood. The victim's family sat 3 rows back, their grief a physical presence that seemed to push against the wooden pews. The mother clutched a photograph, 2 identical smiling faces, frozen in happier times before one of those faces would be forever erased. The evidence began accumulating before the opening statements even concluded. A tablet, forensically examined, revealed a search history that would haunt everyone who read it. How much poison kills a person? What poison tastes like nothing? Can poison be traced after death? These weren't questions asked in a moment of curiosity or teenage darkness. These were inquiries made with purpose, timing them carefully, written in a pattern that suggested research, planning, and preparation. The timestamps showed searches made weeks before the poisoning occurred. Weeks, not hours of impulsive rage, weeks of contemplation and preparation. The prosecutor would present each search result to the jury methodically, letting the evidence speak through digital footprints that couldn't be explained away by age or confusion or temporary insanity. The defense had no response to timestamps. The defense had no argument against the Internet's permanent memory. What made this case transcend typical juvenile delinquency was the precision of execution. The poison chosen was household-based, something that existed in the family's cleaning cabinet, something that wouldn't immediately trigger suspicion because it was ordinary. The dosage was measured carefully, enough to cause severe distress, enough to be fatal, but not so excessive that it would be immediately obvious to emergency responders what they were dealing with. The delivery was camouflaged within a beloved drink that the victim consumed willingly. No struggle, no awareness that her twin sister had transformed their shared evening routine into a murder weapon. The method suggested knowledge that had been acquired specifically for this purpose. No frantic decision, no heated moment of anger, followed by regret. Just cold, methodical execution disguised as an accident. The detective who first examined the scene would later testify that the way the poison drink was presented, casual, normal, unchanged from any other evening, was the moment she realized they were dealing with something deliberately calculated. The judge reviewed the photographs of the victim one more time before proceedings began. A 14-year-old girl who had loved reading, who had anxiety issues that made her cling to her twin sister, who had been trusting enough to drink whatever her identical counterpart offered her. The contrast between these photographs and the hollow-eyed girl sitting in the defendant's chair was more devastating than any closing argument could articulate. This was not a case of negligence or momentary darkness. This was about one girl making the conscious decision to eliminate another girl from existence, and then sitting through a courtroom with composure so complete that it suggested either sociopathic detachment or a rehearsed performance so practiced that normal human emotion no longer interrupted it. The judge's gavel remained untouched, waiting for the moment when all evidence would culminate in a decision that would change juvenile law precedent forever. But before that moment came, the courtroom would need to understand exactly how a 12-year-old girl had become a killer. What nobody realized yet, sitting in those opening moments of testimony, was that the poison hadn't been her first attempt to eliminate her sister from her life. The tablet searches would later reveal previous inquiries, abandoned methodologies, failed plans discarded because they lacked precision. This was not a crime of impulse. This was the culmination of months of research, planning, and rejection of lesser methods until she had perfected the one that would work. The judge would later say, after reading her journal entries discovered during the police search, that this was the moment childhood truly ended, not in the courtroom, but in that moment months earlier when a 12-year-old girl decided that her sister's existence was negotiable, that poison was preferable to confrontation, and that getting away with murder was more important than the bond they shared through blood, genetics, and 15 years of shared existence. From the moment they were born, the twins were identical mirrors. Same birth weight, same cry, same genetic code, replicated perfectly. But within months, their mothers and father noticed something profound. Two identical faces housing two completely different souls. The victim, whose name was Maya, came into the world as the quieter twin. She was the one who needed reassurance before attempting anything new. She was the one who hugged rather than confronted, who asked permission rather than assumed authority, whose anxiety manifested in small ways that parents recognized as sensitivity rather than weakness. Her twin sister Alexandria was her opposite in every way that mattered. Alexandria was confident, bordering on arrogant. She spoke first, acted first, and seemed to operate with a certainty about her place in the world that no 12-year-old should possess. Where Maya sought approval, Alexandria assumed entitlement. Where Maya questioned her own value, Alexandria never seemed to doubt her superiority. Their bedroom was decorated with matching twin beds, matching nightstands, matching curtains in soft lavender. But on one side of the room, posters reflected a gentle, imaginative spirit. Book covers, soft art, inspirational quotes about kindness. On the other side, the walls displayed something different, competitive trophies from activities neither twin actually excelled at. Photographs where Alexandria posed prominently while Maya stood slightly in the background. Teachers would later describe these bedroom differences as telling, as if the physical space itself had become a metaphor for the psychological distance that had grown between the girls. Their mother decorated the room to feel equal, to celebrate their bond as twins. But the girls themselves had already written a narrative where one was the protagonist and the other was merely supporting cast. The home itself, a 3-bedroom suburban house with white shutters, a manicured lawn, and a driveway where both girls' bicycles leaned against the garage, looked like the setting for a perfect family narrative. No one would have guessed what was happening behind those windows. School records revealed a pattern that parents often miss because they're too close to it, too invested in the belief that siblings eventually grow out of dominance dynamics. Maya's teachers consistently noted her kindness, her empathy, her willingness to help classmates who struggled. She was not the academic star, not the athlete, not the girl with automatic social currency. But she was the girl who remembered when someone had a birthday, who shared her lunch with kids who forgot theirs, who made friends with the socially isolated because she understood what it felt like to stand slightly apart. Alexandria's teachers used different language: intelligent, competitive, self-assured. But buried in the notes, if you knew how to read between the lines, were subtle observations. Dominates group work, takes credit for collaborative projects, struggles with accepting other perspectives. The school counselor had actually noted during a routine check-in that Alexandria displayed unusually confident self-assessment for her age and recommended the parents monitor for signs of narcissistic tendencies. That note was filed away and forgotten until after everything happened. At home, the twins shared the rhythm of typical sibling life: breakfast together, school together, afternoon snacks together, bedtime in the same room. But those hours were filled with subtle domination strategies that only became visible in retrospect. Maya was excluded from Alexandria's private conversations, kept out of her friend groups, mocked for her interests in a way that seemed playful on the surface, but cut deeper each time. When Maya achieved something, Alexandria found ways to diminish it. When Maya made a friend, Alexandria would somehow befriend that person too, then gradually isolate Maya from the relationship. Parents attributed this to normal twin dynamics, to the give and take of sharing space with an identical person who was simultaneously your closest friend and most obvious rival. The mother, years later, would struggle with guilt over not recognizing that what she'd dismissed as sibling rivalry was actually a systematic pattern of psychological dominance that was breaking her gentler daughter piece by piece. The victim's last school day began like any other ordinary day in the ordinary suburban rhythm that masked extraordinary darkness. Maya wore a favorite sweater, the soft green one that made her feel confident. She brought her favorite lunch to school. She participated in class discussions, answered questions correctly, made a note in her agenda about an upcoming test she wanted to study for. Friends remembered her being in a good mood, cheerful, laughing at jokes during lunch period. No one who saw her that day saw a girl who was about to die at the hands of someone who shared her face, her DNA, her childhood. When she came home from school, she hung her backpack on the hook by the front door, changed into comfortable clothes, and settled into the evening routine that had been carefully planned by her sister weeks in advance. The last conversation she had with her parents was about homework and dinner plans. Her last interaction with her twin sister was a smile, completely trusting, completely unaware that trust was about to become a fatal vulnerability. The image that would haunt everyone later was devastatingly simple. Two identical backpacks hanging side by side on the hooks by the front door. Both navy blue, both embroidered with the girl's initials, both filled with homework and textbooks and the ordinary detritus of schoolchildren's days. After the poisoning, after the emergency responders, after the chaos of that night, one backpack remained. Maya's was eventually removed by her mother during a time when the grief was so fresh it had no shape yet, when shock still protected her from understanding that she would never help her daughter with homework again. That remaining backpack empty and untouched, would sit in a closet for years. The parents couldn't bring themselves to throw it away, couldn't open it and confront the textbooks inside, couldn't acknowledge the normalcy it represented. A girl who had expected to wake up the next morning and continue her ordinary life. But she wouldn't wake up. She would never open another textbook, never eat another lunch at school, never laugh with her friends again. The evening began unremarkably, which was precisely how Alexandria had planned it. Dinner was at 6 o'clock, the family sitting around their kitchen table. Both parents present, both twins in their usual seats. Conversation flowing with the comfortable rhythm of a household that believed itself to be functioning normally. The menu was ordinary: chicken, vegetables, bread. Maya talked about her day at school, about an assignment due Friday, about a friend's birthday party coming up. Alexandria ate quietly, listening, observing, waiting for the moment when everyone would finish their main course and move toward dessert. This was the window she had identified through weeks of observation. This was the moment when attention would be divided, when her parents would be clearing dishes, when the kitchen would become momentarily less supervised. The father mentioned needing to check emails for work. The mother started loading the dishwasher. The twins were left alone at the table, which happened regularly enough that it raised no suspicion. The poisoned drink had been prepared in advance, sitting innocuously in the refrigerator inside a clear glass container that looked identical to the juice both girls drank regularly. Alexandria had measured the poison with precision, using a kitchen scale borrowed from her friend's house to ensure accuracy. The substance was dissolved completely, invisible, tasteless enough when combined with the sweet juice that had been carefully chosen to mask any residual chemical flavor. The glass she selected was slightly heavier than the others, a detail no one would ever notice. She poured the poison juice with the casual confidence of someone performing an action she had mentally rehearsed hundreds of times. She set it in front of her sister with a smile that would, in retrospect, contain every lie a 12-year-old could manage to compress into a single facial expression. "You look thirsty," she said. It was the kind of thing a sister might say. It was the kind of thing that would make the victim feel cared for, connected, safe in the presence of someone who shared her exact face. Maya picked up the glass without hesitation and began to drink. The symptoms began approximately 20 minutes after the glass was empty. Maya complained of stomach discomfort, a sharp pain that made her wince. She mentioned feeling dizzy, confused about why she was suddenly feeling so unwell when she'd been fine moments before. The parents, alerted by her complaints, moved into concerned parent mode, checking her temperature, asking detailed questions about what she'd eaten that day, wondering if she was coming down with a virus. Alexandria watched from across the room with an expression of concerned sisterhood so perfectly performed that it would later appear in photographs from that evening as if she were a different person from the girl who would be convicted of murder. She suggested her sister go lie down. She offered to bring her water. She demonstrated the kind of solicitous care that would, had anyone been looking carefully, ring every alarm bell of premeditation. But no one was looking carefully. They were looking at a sick child and trying to figure out what was wrong. What was wrong became increasingly evident as the night progressed. Maya's condition deteriorated rapidly. The stomach pain intensified into something beyond normal illness. She began vomiting, her small body racked with convulsions that frightened everyone in the household. Her confusion deepened. She couldn't articulate where the pain was centered, couldn't describe what was happening to her in any way that made sense to her parents. The mother called their pediatrician, who suggested monitoring and recommended they bring her to the emergency room if the symptoms worsened. The symptoms worsened. Within the hour, Maya was barely conscious, her breathing becoming shallow, her skin taking on a grayish pallor that terrified everyone around her. Alexandria remained calm throughout all of this, which was perhaps the most damning detail of all. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. She didn't demonstrate the kind of fear or confusion that a sister would naturally express watching her identical twin deteriorate into a medical emergency. She simply observed, her face arranged in an expression of concern that never wavered, never broke, never revealed the satisfaction that might have been lurking beneath. The emergency room was chaos the moment they arrived, the kind of controlled medical urgency that makes everything feel both frantic and strangely slow. Paramedics rushed the girl into a trauma bay. Nurses began establishing IV lines, drawing blood, hooking monitors to her small body. The smell that the emergency responders would later describe as the most immediately telling detail was chemical, wrong, not consistent with any natural illness pattern. One experienced nurse who had worked trauma for 15 years would testify that she knew within minutes they were dealing with poisoning rather than infection or accident. The toxicology would be ordered immediately. The blood work would be rushed to the lab. But as those medical professionals worked with everything they had learned in years of training, something became clear to everyone present. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Something had been administered to this child with purpose and precision. The resuscitation attempts continued for 47 minutes. The medical team did everything protocol demanded. They administered medications designed to counteract various poisons. They oxygenated her lungs, pumped her heart, flooded her veins with fluids to try to dilute the toxin. Her parents watched from the observation window, their faces reflecting the understanding that was slowly crystallizing into nightmare. Beside them, Alexandria stood with her arms crossed, watching her sister's body jerking with each defibrillation attempt, her expression never wavering. When the attending physician finally looked at the clock and made the decision to stop, when he turned to face the parents with the expression they would see every night in their dreams for the rest of their lives, Alexandria's face remained unchanged. Maya was pronounced dead at 11:47 p.m. on an ordinary Thursday night that would become the dividing line between before and after for everyone who knew her. The toxicology results came back within 6 hours, and they changed everything. The emergency room physician, who had spent 47 minutes trying to resuscitate a 14-year-old girl, called the detective on call with a voice that conveyed something beyond professional concern. The substance in Maya's bloodstream was not something that accumulated naturally, not something that could be explained by food contamination or environmental exposure. It was deliberate, it was added, it was poison in its purest, most unambiguous form. The moment those results were confirmed, the case transformed from a tragic medical emergency into a criminal investigation. The emergency room transitioned from a place of healing into a crime scene. Every tissue sample, every piece of evidence, every detail about how the poisoning occurred suddenly mattered in ways that no one had anticipated when this night began. The police were notified, the room was sealed, and the investigation into what had initially been classified as a sudden unexplained death in a child became a murder investigation. The parents were separated almost immediately, taken into different interview rooms by detectives who had to navigate the impossible task of investigating a crime while the victims were still processing grief, so new it had no language yet. The father was questioned first, his shock so profound that he could barely articulate his answers. He described the evening, the dinner, the sudden illness. He wept openly when discussing his daughter's final moments, his hands shaking as he tried to remember details that seemed simultaneously crucial and irrelevant. Had there been anything unusual about the evening? No. Had Maya complained of feeling ill before dinner? No. Had anyone outside the family been in the home? No. The detective noted everything, his expression remaining professionally neutral while internally understanding that the father's grief was authentic, that the devastation in his eyes was the genuine response of someone who had lost a child to something he couldn't have predicted or prevented. When asked about the other daughter, the father went blank for a moment, as if he had forgotten that Alexandria still existed, that somewhere in this building his surviving child was also being questioned. The mother's interview followed a similar trajectory of shock and anguish, but with additional layers of maternal guilt that would consume her for years afterward. She described feeling responsible, going through the moment-by-moment replay that bereaved parents torture themselves with. Could she have noticed something earlier? Could she have gotten Maya to the hospital faster? Could she have prevented any of this if she had simply been more attentive? She spoke about her children with the love of a mother who believed she knew her twins completely, who thought she understood their relationship, who had no framework for comprehending that one of her daughters had systematically planned the death of the other. The detective asked about conflicts between the girls, about any tensions or arguments that had seemed unusual. The mother, thinking back through ordinary sibling dynamics, mentioned the typical things: competition for attention, the occasional argument about television shows, or whose turn it was to use the bathroom. Nothing that suggested murder. Nothing that suggested one twin would poison the other's drink and then sit calmly watching the consequences unfold. Alexandria's interview was different in ways that would later become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She was brought into a small room with a detective trained in adolescent interviews, and she was informed that her sister had died. The question of how she processed this information, or rather, how she appeared to process it, would haunt everyone who witnessed it. She showed no tears. She asked no questions about what had happened. She didn't ask how her sister had died, or whether anything could have been done to save her, or where her parents were in that moment. Instead, she sat calmly, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for the next question. When asked about the evening, she provided a narrative that was almost too perfectly coherent, too well organized, too practiced sounding to be a child's genuine recollection. She mentioned dinner, She mentioned her sister getting sick. She mentioned their parents' concern. But her affect remained completely flat throughout. There was no tremor in her voice. There was no physiological response to the news that her identical twin, her lifelong companion, the person she'd shared a womb with, was now dead. The detective who conducted that interview would later testify that the lack of emotional response was what first triggered his suspicion. Children grieve differently than adults, he explained to the jury. But there are consistent patterns of shock, confusion, emotional disruption, even in children with significant emotional challenges. Alexandria displayed none of these patterns. She responded to questions with precision, as if she had anticipated them and prepared answers in advance. When asked if she knew how her sister had become ill, she replied, "No, I don't know. She just started complaining about her stomach." When asked if she had given her sister anything to drink or eat before the illness started, she hesitated for exactly 1 second before answering. "She had juice. I don't remember if I gave it to her or if she got it herself." That hesitation, that fractional delay in a response that should have been automatic, registered in the detective's trained observation as inconsistent with genuine memory. It registered as a practiced lie that had been rehearsed so many times that the seams were beginning to show under pressure. The lab confirmed the poison within the next 12 hours. Household chemical, commonly available, the kind of substance that existed in most suburban homes and wouldn't have triggered any warning signs had it been found in a cleaning cabinet. But the concentration in Maya's bloodstream indicated precise measurement, careful dosing, not accidental ingestion. The investigators began examining the family home with the understanding that whoever had administered this poison had done so deliberately, methodically, with planning and forethought. They found the container in the kitchen cabinet, fingerprints still visible on its surface. They examined the family's tablet computers and computers, looking for any evidence of how someone might have acquired knowledge about poison dosages and delivery methods. Within hours, what had been filed as a tragic accident was officially reclassified as homicide. A murder had occurred in a suburban home, and the person who had committed it was still living under the same roof as her grieving parents, still sleeping in the bedroom she shared with the victim, still wearing the facade of a devastated twin sister. The moment the detective obtained the warrant to seize the family's electronic devices, the case transformed from suspicion into inevitability. The tablet that belonged to Alexandria was a newer model, the kind of device that keeps detailed records of every search, every web page visited, every keystroke typed into it. Unlike human memory, which can be selective or unreliable, digital forensics don't lie. They don't forget. They don't rearrange events to fit a preferred narrative. What the digital forensics expert found when examining that tablet would later be presented to the jury as an unambiguous roadmap of premeditation stretching back months into the past. This wasn't a crime of momentary anger or teenage impulse. This was the digital footprint of someone doing research, planning, discarding ideas, and refining a methodology until it had been perfected into something executable. The search history read like a graduate thesis on murder, conducted by a 12-year-old child operating from a bedroom in suburban America. The searches began appearing in the tablet's history approximately 3 months before the poisoning occurred. The earliest entries were broad, almost academically curious in their framing. What poisons are deadly to humans? How long does it take for poison to work? What household chemicals can be fatal? These weren't searches conducted in a moment of rage or emotional turmoil. They were methodical investigations into a subject that Alexandria had apparently decided to study with the same thoroughness she might apply to a school project. The timestamps showed these searches occurring late at night after the household had gone to sleep, suggesting deliberate attempts to avoid detection or observation. As the weeks progressed, the searches became more specific, more refined, more focused on a particular methodology. Poison that tastes like nothing. How to dissolve poison in liquid without changing taste. Poison that won't show up in regular blood tests. The progression was terrifying in its logical development, each search building on the previous one, each query narrowing the field until Alexandria had apparently identified exactly what she needed. The most chilling searches appeared approximately 1 month before the poisoning. How much poison kills a 14-year-old? The specificity was devastating. She wasn't researching generalized information about lethal dosages. She was calculating the exact amount of poison needed to kill someone of her sister's approximate weight and age. The search results included medical information, toxicology data, case studies from actual deaths. The tablet's browsing history showed that Alexandria had clicked through these results, had apparently read them thoroughly, had taken whatever information was available, and used it to construct a plan. Deleted browser history would later be recovered by the forensics expert, revealing that someone had attempted to remove these searches from the tablet's visible record. But digital deletion isn't actually deletion. Data persists on devices in recoverable fragments, and the expert was able to reconstruct the hidden searches with precision, presenting them to the investigation as definitive proof that Alexandria had deliberately concealed her research. Beyond the searches themselves, deleted messages were recovered from the tablet's messaging applications. These communications, which Alexandria had apparently attempted to erase, contained conversations with other children where she had expressed her feelings about her sister in language so blunt it seemed almost designed to incriminate herself. One message, recovered in fragmented form but reconstructible, read, "She won't bother me anymore. I'm going to fix the problem." Another stated, "I know exactly how to do it and no one will ever figure it out." A third contained simply, "She deserves what's coming." These messages weren't hypothetical discussions or angry venting that teenagers might engage in. These were statements of intent, declarations of purpose, communications that indicated Alexandria had already made the decision to poison her sister and had possibly shared that intention with peers who apparently didn't take her seriously or didn't believe she would actually follow through with such a plan. The timeline that digital forensics constructed was devastatingly coherent. 3 months of research, 2 months of plan refinement, 1 month of specific dosage calculations, 3 weeks of identifying the exact poison to use, 2 weeks of acquiring the substance from the household cleaning supplies, 1 week of psychological preparation, and then execution on a Thursday evening in what appeared to be an ordinary family dinner. The detective presented this timeline to the prosecutor with the understanding that this was not ambiguous evidence open to interpretation. This was a child who had spent an entire quarter of a year planning her sister's murder. The prosecutor understood that this timeline would be critical in convincing the jury and potentially even in convincing the judge that an adult trial was appropriate for a 12-year-old defendant. The law had provisions for trying juveniles as adults when the crime demonstrated sufficient maturity and planning. This case demonstrated both in overwhelming measure. Additional searches recovered from the tablet revealed that Alexandria had also researched what happens after murder. Do people get caught for murder if they don't confess? How do forensic investigations work? What mistakes do murderers make? These weren't casual inquiries. These were searches conducted by someone attempting to understand how to commit a crime and potentially avoid detection. She had apparently examined case studies of other murders, researched investigation procedures, and studied enough criminal methodology to understand that poison left traceable residue in the body, but that if she could convince everyone it was an accident, the investigation might conclude differently. The fact that she had massively underestimated the sophistication of modern toxicology was perhaps the only thing that stood between her and successfully getting away with her sister's death. The warrant for arrest was approved based on this digital evidence alone, even before the physical forensics could be fully processed. A detective arrived at the family home with papers in hand, and Alexandria was informed that she was being taken into custody. She showed no resistance. She showed no emotional response. She simply gathered whatever she needed and followed the detective to the vehicle, with the same calm demeanor she had maintained throughout every interview. As she was placed in the back of the patrol car, neighbors watched from their suburban windows, trying to comprehend how a child who looked so ordinary, so small, so apparently innocent, could be arrested for murdering her identical twin sister. The case was about to enter the trial phase, and every piece of evidence prepared thus far was designed to demonstrate one undeniable truth. This was not an accident. This was not a moment of impulse. This was murder with intent. The psychiatric evaluation ordered by the court was conducted by a specialist in adolescent psychology who had examined hundreds of children and teenagers over a career spanning 3 decades. She arrived at the detention facility where Alexandria was being held and conducted a comprehensive assessment designed to understand the psychological profile of a 12-year-old who had poisoned her twin sister and then maintained composure throughout arrest and preliminary questioning. The psychologist administered standardized tests measuring empathy, emotional regulation, impulse control, and personality traits. She conducted extensive interviews designed to elicit emotional responses, to understand Alexandria's internal experience, to map the landscape of her psychological functioning. What emerged from these evaluations was a profile so consistent with specific personality disorders that the psychologist would later describe it as textbook, as if Alexandria had been designed by DSM-5 to embody every warning sign of serious psychological pathology masquerading as a child. The most striking finding was the absence of empathy in any meaningful sense. When asked directly about her sister's death, Alexandria responded with language that was cognitively accurate but emotionally hollow. She acknowledged that Maya was dead. She understood that this was permanent, but she expressed no sadness, no regret, no sense of loss. Instead, she expressed frustration that she had been caught, frustration that the investigation had uncovered her planning, frustration that her parents were upset and that the household had been disrupted. The psychologist noted in her report that this was not the response of a traumatized child processing guilt. This was the response of someone who had experienced an inconvenience, who had anticipated getting away with her crime, and was annoyed that forensic science had interfered with that plan. When asked if she felt any remorse for what she had done, Alexandria's response was chillingly direct. "I don't feel bad about it. She was in my way, and now she's not anymore." No equivocation, no attempt to soften the statement. Just absolute clarity about her motivation and her lack of emotional connection to the consequences. The journals discovered in Alexandria's bedroom during the search provided additional layers of psychological documentation that the prosecutor would use to establish her state of mind in the months leading up to the poisoning. These weren't the typical teenage diaries filled with complaints about school and crushes and social anxieties. These were extended meditations on resentment, on jealousy, on perceived slights and injustices that existed primarily in Alexandria's interpretation of reality. She wrote extensively about how her sister received more attention from their parents, how teachers seemed to like Maya more, how their mother made special efforts to include Maya in conversations. But when detectives re-interviewed the parents about these accusations, they consistently reported that they had attempted to treat both daughters equally, that they had made conscious efforts to ensure neither twin felt overlooked. What the journals revealed was not an accurate accounting of family dynamics, but rather Alexandria's distorted perception of those dynamics, her transformation of ordinary parental attention and normal social interactions into a narrative where she was perpetually undervalued and her sister was perpetually favored. The journals also contained something more disturbing, a chronicle of attempted dominant strategies that had apparently begun years before the final poisoning. Alexandria wrote about deliberately excluding Maya from friend groups, about spreading rumors designed to damage her sister's social reputation, about sabotaging her academic work by interfering with homework assignments. She documented these actions with a precision that suggested she was proud of them, that she saw them as victories in an ongoing competition where her twin sister represented the primary obstacle to her own dominance. One particularly chilling entry read, "She thinks everyone likes her, but they only pretend. I'm making sure everyone knows what she's really like. She'll be alone soon, and then she'll know what it feels like to have nothing." This wasn't written weeks before the poisoning. This was written 18 months earlier, documenting a systematic campaign of psychological destruction that had apparently culminated in the decision that psychological dominance wasn't sufficient, that physical elimination was necessary. The psychologist's formal diagnosis included language that the prosecution would use repeatedly throughout the trial: narcissistic traits, lack of empathy, manipulative behavior patterns, possible early-stage antisocial personality disorder. But diagnosis was less important than the behavior it explained. Alexandria had apparently spent years practicing the skill of emotional manipulation, of appearing to be something she wasn't, of maintaining a facade of normalcy while experiencing no genuine connection to anyone around her. Her teachers described her as a good student who showed no behavioral problems. Her extended family described her as pleasant and well-behaved. Her pediatrician had no concerns about her psychological functioning. She had apparently perfected the art of appearing normal while experiencing the world through a filter where other people existed, primarily as obstacles or tools rather than as individuals with inherent value and dignity. The poison wasn't her first attempt to eliminate her sister. It was simply the first method that had worked. The first strategy in her campaign of psychological and eventually physical domination that had actually succeeded in achieving her stated objective. When prosecutors prepared for trial, they understood that the psychological evaluation provided something even more valuable than diagnosis. It provided explanation without excuse. It demonstrated that Alexandria understood the difference between right and wrong, that she was capable of planning and executing complex actions, that she had deliberately chosen to poison her sister despite understanding the consequences. She wasn't insane. She wasn't confused. She wasn't operating under the influence of temporary emotional dysregulation. She was, according to every psychological marker available, entirely aware of what she was doing and deliberately committed to doing it anyway. The question before the court would not be whether she was sick. The question would be whether a child who was this sick needed to be treated as an adult in the criminal justice system. The recorded interview began on a Tuesday afternoon in a small room designed to be neutral, to be unthreatening, but which somehow managed to feel more claustrophobic the longer it continued. Alexandria sat across a metal table from a detective with 20 years of interrogation experience, a man who had conducted hundreds of interviews with suspects ranging from desperate street criminals to white-collar executives attempting to minimize their culpability. But he had never conducted an interrogation with a 12-year-old girl who displayed absolutely zero concern about her circumstances. The camera mounted in the corner recorded everything, every word spoken, every micro-expression that might cross Alexandria's face, every moment of silence that stretched between question and answer. The detective began with the basics, establishing her identity, confirming her understanding that this was an official investigation, reading her rights in language she appeared to comprehend with complete clarity. She nodded at appropriate moments. She made eye contact. She appeared, to anyone watching this recording, to be a cooperative child answering questions about a family tragedy. The detective began with non-confrontational questions, the standard investigative approach designed to establish baseline behavior before introducing evidence that might trigger defensive reactions. He asked about her relationship with her sister. Alexandria answered that they were close, that they did everything together, that she would miss her. The words were correct. The delivery was entirely wrong. There was no grief in her voice. There was no tremor suggesting emotional difficulty in articulating feelings about her dead sister. It was as if she were reciting lines from a script, performing what she understood a grieving sibling should say, while experiencing none of the emotional underpinnings that would make those words authentic. The detective noted this discrepancy mentally and moved forward, watching carefully as he began to introduce evidence. He slid photographs across the table, the tablet, the poison container, the messages recovered from deleted files. As each piece of evidence appeared, he watched for her reaction. What he saw was something approaching amusement. When the search history was presented, when the detective read aloud the searches Alexandria had conducted about lethal poison dosages, he watched carefully for denial, for attempts to claim the tablet belonged to someone else, for any of the defensive strategies that guilty parties typically employed. Instead, Alexandria corrected him. "That's not exactly how the search was phrased," she said calmly. "I searched for how much poison kills, not poison that kills people." The wording matters. She was correcting the detective's recitation of her own incriminating searches, demonstrating not only that she remembered conducting them, but that she was comfortable discussing them with surprising precision. The detective felt something shift in the interview, a moment where the pretense of cooperation became irrelevant, because Alexandria had apparently decided that pretense was no longer useful. She knew what evidence existed. She knew what it demonstrated. And she seemed almost relieved to finally acknowledge it openly. When confronted with the messages where she had stated her sister won't bother me anymore, Alexandria's response was so direct that it bordered on casual. "I meant it," she said. "She was always there. Everything I did she was watching. Everything I wanted to do, she was in the way. I researched it because I wanted to know if it would work. And it did work." The detective felt the weight of those words settle into the room. This was not a child attempting to minimize responsibility. This was a child explaining her actions with the clarity of someone who had thought them through extensively and had no intention of pretending she hadn't. When asked if she felt bad about what she had done, Alexandria tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether honesty or performance would be more advantageous. She apparently decided on honesty. "No," she said, "I don't feel bad. She's gone, and I'm not." That was the point. The detective introduced the physical evidence, fingerprints matching Alexandria's pattern on the poison container, her handling documented through forensic analysis. He presented toxicology results showing the precise dosage that had been administered, calculations that matched the searches she had conducted. He laid out the timeline, showing how the poisoning fit perfectly into the planning that had been documented across months of digital activity. As each piece of evidence was presented, Alexandria remained calm, occasionally nodding as if affirming accuracy. When the detective asked her directly if she had poisoned her sister's drink, she paused for exactly 2 seconds and then said, "Yes, I did. I measured it carefully so it would work but not be obvious immediately. If I had put too much, someone would have realized it was poison. If I put too little, it might not have worked." She was explaining the methodology with the detachment of someone discussing a chemistry experiment, completely separated from the reality that the subject of that methodology was her identical twin, her lifelong companion, the person with whom she had shared every moment of her life. The detective asked her to describe the moment when she administered the poison, and Alexandria provided a narrative so complete in its detail that it seemed she had been waiting for the opportunity to tell someone exactly what had happened. She described preparing the juice, measuring the poison, the sensation of handing it to her sister, the decision to sit and watch as the effects began to take hold. She described her internal experience, no panic, no guilt, no sudden realization of what she had done wrong, just observation, detachment, satisfaction as her plan executed exactly as she had calculated it would. She described watching her sister become ill, watching her parents become concerned, watching the medical response unfold, and never once feeling anything beyond an intellectual appreciation for how events were unfolding according to her design. When asked if she would do it again if given the opportunity, her response was simple. "If I had to, yes, but I wouldn't get caught next time." The detective ended the recorded interview feeling something he rarely experienced in his professional life, a kind of existential disturbance. He had interrogated adults who had committed terrible crimes, criminals who understood the gravity of what they had done and were attempting to minimize responsibility. But he had never encountered a 12-year-old who discussed murdering her twin sister with the detached precision of someone planning a school project. As the camera recorded the final minutes of the interview, as Alexandria sat calmly answering the last few procedural questions, the detective understood something that would become central to the prosecution's case. This was not a damaged child. This was a child who had calculated exactly what she wanted and had executed that calculation without hesitation, without regret, and without any apparent capacity to understand why anyone would expect her to feel differently about what she had accomplished. The prosecutor's announcement came during a press conference held outside the courthouse, and it reverberated through media outlets with the force of a seismic event. The state would seek life without parole for Alexandria. Not life with the possibility of parole, not a juvenile sentence with potential for release as an adult, but life imprisonment with absolutely no pathway toward freedom, no mechanism for eventual release, no possibility of rehabilitation into society. It was a decision that placed Alexandria in a category typically reserved for adults who had committed heinous crimes, serial murderers, mass killers, individuals whose danger to society was deemed so complete that they could never be allowed to rejoin the general population. The prosecutor stood at the microphone with papers organized in front of her, her expression grave, her voice steady as she laid out the evidence that had led to this determination. A 12-year-old child had murdered her twin sister through carefully planned poisoning. This was not a case of juvenile delinquency. This was a case of calculated homicide executed with such precision that it demanded the maximum severity the legal system could impose. The defense team's response came within hours, and it immediately crystallized the central moral question that would define this case for everyone who followed it. The defendant was 12 years old. Her brain was not fully developed. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and understanding consequences, didn't fully mature until the mid-20s. How could the state justify treating a child whose brain was still in active development as if she were an adult capable of full culpability for her actions? The defense argued that developmental neuroscience demonstrated conclusively that children operated under different neurological constraints than adults. That judgment and impulse control were genuinely compromised by age, that a life sentence for a child was proportionally disproportionate regardless of the crime. The arguments were legally sound, supported by years of neuroscientific research, presented by defense attorneys who genuinely believed that the prosecution was asking the court to exceed its authority by treating a child as something she could not yet be, a fully responsible adult. The media erupted in a frenzy of coverage that spanned from serious legal analysis to sensationalized tabloid speculation. National news networks sent reporters to the small suburban town where the crime had occurred. Cable news hosted panels of legal experts debating the appropriateness of adult prosecution for a child. Social media fractured into warring camps, one side arguing that the crime's severity demanded adult consequences regardless of age. The other insisting that brain development science should protect even murderers from adult sentencing. Hashtags trended, petitions circulated. The case became something beyond a local tragedy or even a national news story. It became a referendum on childhood, on criminal culpability, on the definition of justice itself. People who had never met Alexandria or Maya, who lived thousands of miles away, suddenly had strong opinions about how the state should punish a 12-year-old girl for poisoning her twin sister. The town itself became a destination for true crime enthusiasts, for legal scholars, for activists representing every perspective on juvenile justice. The parents existed in a state of existential impossibility. They had lost one daughter to poisoning. They now faced the prospect of losing a second daughter to the criminal justice system. The mother and father tried to maintain some kind of normal functioning while their surviving child was incarcerated, while their dead child's case consumed every news cycle, while their family name became synonymous with tragedy. They had to testify about the daughter they had lost while facing the impossible reality that the daughter who had killed her was biologically and legally their responsibility. The father struggled with conflicting emotions, grief for Maya, confusion about Alexandria, anger at both, guilt about both, shame about having raised a child capable of such calculation. The mother went through periods of defending her surviving daughter, trying to understand how her child had arrived at murder as a solution. Attempting to find some explanation that made sense, but there was no explanation that mitigated the reality. One of her daughters had deliberately killed the other, and justice demanded that consequence follow, regardless of how the family fractured in the process. The judge scheduled hearings specifically to determine whether an adult trial was appropriate. These weren't the trial itself, but rather preliminary determinations about jurisdiction and charging authority. The prosecutor presented evidence of premeditation, of calculation, of the apparent sophistication of the crime. She argued that the law allowed for adult prosecution of juveniles when the crime demonstrated unusual maturity and planning. The defense countered that maturity in execution didn't equal maturity of cognition, that a child could be taught to perform complex actions without having developed the neurological capacity for true understanding of consequences. Expert witnesses testified about brain development. Psychologists discussed moral reasoning in children. The judge listened carefully, understanding that his decision would set precedent, would potentially impact how similar cases were handled going forward, would determine whether this child would spend the rest of her life in an adult prison or in the juvenile system where she might eventually be released as an adult. The decision came on a Friday afternoon. The judge ruled that the defendant would be tried as an adult. The legal reasoning was complex, referencing the severity of the crime, the evidence of planning and premeditation, the apparent sophistication of the methodology. But the simple reality was that the state would pursue its case in adult court, seeking an adult sentence, treating a 12-year-old girl as if she possessed the full culpability of an adult defendant. The ruling triggered immediate response. Some celebrated it as justice, others condemned it as an atrocity. Most sat somewhere in the middle, uncertain whether the law had done what was right or had simply done what was possible. The courtroom began filling daily with spectators interested in watching a case that had become a national obsession. Alexandria arrived each morning with her defense team, sometimes smiling, sometimes maintaining her characteristic flat effect. She seemed almost curious about the proceedings, as if she were observing a legal process that had nothing to do with her rather than one designed to determine the rest of her life. The judge banged his gavel, called court to order, and the trial that would define childhood's end began. The prosecution's case began with science, with the kind of objective evidence that couldn't be argued or reinterpreted or explained away through the lens of sympathy or reasonable doubt. The toxicologist took the stand on the opening day of testimony, a woman with credentials spanning decades of analyzing poisoning cases for law enforcement agencies across multiple states. She presented her findings methodically, walking the jury through the chemical compound found in Maya's bloodstream, explaining its properties, its effects on the human body, the timeline of absorption and systemic distribution. She testified about the precise dosage that had been administered, explaining how toxicology could determine not just what poison had been used, but approximately how much had been consumed. The jury listened with intensity, understanding that they were hearing the scientific foundation upon which the entire case would be built. The toxicologist explained that the dosage was consistent with someone who had researched lethal amounts and had carefully calibrated the poison to ensure death while maintaining the appearance of possibility that it might have been accidental. The digital forensics expert followed, carrying boxes of evidence recovered from Alexandria's tablet and the family's computers. He presented each search result methodically, displayed them on the courtroom screens so the jury could read exactly what Alexandria had typed into search engines in the privacy of her bedroom. How much poison kills a person? What poison has no taste? Poison that won't be detected. The searches accumulated on the screen like a prosecution argument written by the defendant herself, each query building toward the inevitable conclusion that she had been researching precisely how to kill someone without being immediately discovered. The expert explained the recovered deleted messages, showing how fragments of digital data that Alexandria had attempted to erase could be reconstructed, reassembled into language that was chillingly incriminating. He presented timestamps showing the searches had occurred over months, demonstrating that this was not momentary rage followed by action, but rather extended research conducted with methodical precision. The jury watched as the narrative of premeditation unfolded across computer screens, documented in Alexandria's own digital footprint. The forensic chemist testified about the poison container found in the family's cleaning cabinet, explaining how fingerprints recovered from its surface matched Alexandria's fingerprint patterns with scientific certainty. She described the process of handling the poison, the measurement of dosage, the concentration of the chemical compound. She presented calculations showing that the amount of poison that had been administered to Maya was consistent with someone who had researched lethal dosages and had applied that research in actual execution. The courtroom became quiet as the evidence mounted, as each expert witness added another layer of proof that couldn't be disputed or diminished. The prosecution wasn't relying on circumstantial evidence or inference. They were building a case constructed from scientific analysis, digital records, and physical evidence that all pointed toward the same conclusion with devastating certainty. The timeline reconstruction expert presented a detailed chronology of events, minute by minute, showing exactly how the poisoning had occurred. He displayed the family's daily schedule, noting the window of time when Alexandria would have had access to the poison and opportunity to administer it. He showed the minutes between when the poison drink was prepared and when Maya began displaying symptoms, calculating the absorption rate and system distribution based on the toxicology report. He demonstrated that nothing about the timeline suggested accident or impulse. Every moment was accounted for. Every action placed Alexandria in position to commit the crime, every detail consistent with premeditated planning. The jury saw the timeline displayed across the courtroom screens, saw the precision with which the crime had been executed, understood that they were examining the actions of someone who had thought through every detail, who had accounted for timing and methodology, who had executed a plan with the attention to detail that might be expected from an adult criminal with years of experience rather than a child. The interrogation footage was presented next, and this was perhaps the most devastating evidence of all. The jury watched the recorded interview between Alexandria and the detective, saw her sitting calmly across the metal table, heard her voice answering questions about the crime she had committed. They watched her correct the detective's recitation of her own searches, watched her explain the reasoning behind her methodology, watched her describe the moment she handed a poisoned drink to her sister with the detachment of someone discussing a school project. Most importantly, they watched her face as she discussed these events, saw the complete absence of emotion, the flat effect that never wavered regardless of the subject matter. When she stated that her sister was in my way, and now she's not anymore, the jury's faces reflected the understanding that they were observing someone who was fundamentally different from other children. Someone who experienced the world through a psychological filter that made murder seem reasonable. The prosecution rested its case, having presented evidence so overwhelming, so comprehensive, so meticulously documented that the defense team's burden seemed almost impossible. How do you argue against fingerprints on the poison container? How do you dispute digital evidence that the defendant herself had created? How do you explain away a recorded confession where the defendant calmly described her own crime? The defense attorney stood to begin the process of mounting a counter-argument, but everyone in the courtroom understood that counter-argument was now about survival rather than exoneration. The evidence had been so thoroughly presented, so clearly documented, so impossible to dispute that the trial had essentially become about whether the jury would believe their own eyes and ears, whether they would trust the overwhelming proof that Alexandria had deliberately poisoned her twin sister. The jury looked at the defendant, watching her sit calmly in the courtroom, showing no reaction to the hours of evidence that had been presented against her, and they began to understand what the judge had apparently already concluded, that childhood might not be a shield against justice when the crime demonstrated such calculated malice. The mother walked into the courtroom slowly, moving as if navigating through water, her body carrying a weight that had accumulated over months of grief compressed into a single physical form. She was sworn in with her hand trembling so visibly that the court clerk had to guide her through the oath. She sat in the witness stand and looked toward the prosecution, and in that moment, every person in the courtroom understood that they were about to witness something beyond testimony, something beyond legal procedure. They were about to hear a mother describe the daughter she had lost, the daughter she would never see graduate from high school or go to college or fall in love or live any of the ordinary life experiences that had been stolen from her by another daughter's deliberate choice. The prosecutor approached slowly, giving her time to compose herself, though there was no composition possible for a grief this profound. The first questions were foundational, establishing the family structure, confirming the relationship between the mother and both twins, documenting that she had been present in the home on the night of the poisoning. The mother's voice was barely audible as she began describing Maya. She talked about the girl who had been the quieter twin, the child who had always needed reassurance, who had been anxious about trying new things, who had compensated for her social anxiety with acts of kindness that seemed to come from somewhere infinitely deep within her. She described Maya's love of reading, her dreams of becoming a teacher, her kindness to classmates who were struggling socially. The courtroom listened as this mother painted a portrait of a child who had been fundamentally good, whose presence in the world had made that world incrementally better through small acts of compassion. The prosecutor allowed these descriptions to accumulate, understanding that the jury needed to know who the victim had been, needed to understand that this was not merely a crime of poison and toxicology, but a crime that had stolen from the world a person who had mattered, who had been loved, who had been deserving of the life that had been taken from her. Then the prosecutor asked the mother to describe the final school day, the last 24 hours before her daughter died. The mother's voice began to fracture as she recounted the ordinary moments. Maya coming home from school, doing her homework, sitting at the dinner table, talking about an upcoming assignment. These were the moments that parents never imagine will be their last with their child. The moments they treat as unremarkable because they expect infinite more moments to follow. The mother described feeling proud of Maya's enthusiasm about a test coming up, remembered encouraging her to study, remembered saying something about how she knew Maya would do well. She didn't know that would be the last encouragement she would ever give her daughter. She didn't know that the next morning she would wake up to a dead child. The courtroom was silent, absorbing the tragedy of ordinary moments that had become impossibly final. The prosecutor handed the mother a leather-bound journal and asked her if she recognized it. The mother nodded, her hands trembling as she opened it. This was Maya's journal, the private thoughts of a 14-year-old girl, written in her own handwriting. documenting her internal experience in the days before her death. The prosecutor asked if the mother could read the entry from the day before the poisoning occurred. The mother opened the journal and began reading, her voice shaking so badly that she had to stop several times to compose herself. The entry was innocuous in its ordinariness: complaints about homework, excitement about the weekend, speculation about whether a friend liked someone romantically. The final line was, "Tomorrow is going to be good. I can feel it." The mother looked up from the journal and couldn't continue. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, understanding the devastating weight of that final sentence, the girl's absolute certainty that her future existed, that tomorrow would arrive, that she would experience the good thing she could feel coming. But tomorrow never came. The prosecutor asked about Alexandria, asking the mother to describe her relationship with her surviving daughter. The mother struggled with this question, her face reflecting the impossible complexity of having lost one child to death and another to the criminal justice system. She described Alexandria as the more confident twin, the girl who seemed to need less reassurance, who was independent and self-assured in ways that the mother had sometimes admired. She described not recognizing any warning signs, not understanding that the relationship between the twins had become something darker than normal sibling competition. She expressed guilt, profound, overwhelming guilt, that she had dismissed the subtle cruelties as normal twin dynamics, that she hadn't protected Maya from her sister, that she had somehow failed to see what was happening in her own home. The guilt was a physical presence in her testimony, a weight that seemed to crush her further with each word. When the prosecutor asked how the mother was managing now, how her life had changed, her response was almost unbearable in its simplicity. She described empty moments, the times when she expected to see both girls and had to remember again that one was dead and one was in juvenile detention. She described the bedroom they had shared, still decorated with 2 beds, 2 sets of belongings, 2 lives that had been interrupted. She described standing in that room at night and unable to decide which side to clean, which memories to preserve, which evidence of her daughter's existence to maintain. She looked toward Alexandria sitting at the defense table, and for a moment the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see if there would be some recognition between mother and surviving daughter, some moment of connection or acknowledgement. Alexandria looked away, her expression unchanged, her emotional response to her mother's devastation completely absent. The state psychologist who had conducted the psychiatric evaluation of Alexandria took the stand with the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding the darkest corners of human psychology. She was a woman with credentials from prestigious universities, publications in peer-reviewed journals, decades of experience evaluating individuals accused of serious crimes. She had examined Alexandria extensively, conducting interviews, administering psychological tests, reviewing her journals and behavioral history. The prosecutor asked her to summarize her findings, and the psychologist began explaining what she had discovered in her evaluation. A 12-year-old girl who displayed characteristics typically associated with serious personality pathology. She used clinical language, but the meaning was unmistakable. Alexandria showed little to no empathy for others. She demonstrated a consistent pattern of manipulative behavior designed to dominate those around her. She showed no genuine remorse for her actions, only frustration that she had been caught. The psychologist testified about the significance of premeditation in understanding a child's psychological functioning. She explained that impulse control and planning ability were two different neurological capacities. That a child could demonstrate poor impulse control in typical situations while simultaneously showing remarkable planning ability when pursuing a goal they were genuinely motivated to achieve. Alexandria's behavior fit this pattern perfectly. She had engaged in months of careful research, had deliberately sought out information about lethal dosages, had methodically assembled a plan, had executed that plan with attention to detail that most adults would find impressive. This was not the behavior of a child acting on impulse. This was the behavior of someone who knew exactly what she wanted to accomplish and had taken deliberate steps to accomplish it. The fact that she was 12 years old didn't change the reality that she had demonstrated the capacity for long-term planning and goal-directed behavior that suggested a level of cognitive maturity unusual for her age. The defense team presented their own psychological expert, a psychologist who specialized in adolescent development, and who argued that brain development science demonstrated conclusively that children couldn't fully understand consequences, couldn't engage in genuine moral reasoning, couldn't be held fully responsible for their actions regardless of the sophistication of their planning. The expert testified that the prefrontal cortex continued developing into the mid-20s. That judgment and impulse control were fundamentally compromised in adolescence. That any attempt to try a 12-year-old as an adult was a violation of neuroscientific understanding of human development. It was a coherent argument supported by legitimate research, presented by someone who genuinely believed in the developmental limitations of children. But the prosecution's psychologist was allowed to respond, and her response was devastating in its simplicity. She acknowledged that brain development research was accurate and important. She agreed that children had limitations in certain areas of cognitive function. But she pointed out that nothing in brain development research demonstrated that a 12-year-old couldn't understand the difference between right and wrong, couldn't comprehend that poison causes death, couldn't understand that deliberately poisoning someone's drink would likely result in that person's death. The law didn't require that children understand long-term consequences or have fully mature judgment. It required that they understand the basic difference between right and wrong, that they understand their actions can harm others, that they acted with knowledge of these basic moral and physical realities. Alexandria had demonstrated all of these understandings. She had researched poison. She understood it was lethal. She deliberately administered it. The development of the prefrontal cortex didn't change those facts. The prosecution asked the state psychologist directly whether Alexandria demonstrated understanding of right and wrong regarding the act of poisoning her sister. The psychologist's answer was unambiguous. Alexandria had demonstrated throughout her interrogation and in her journals that she understood poisoning was a harmful act, that she understood it would likely result in her sister's death, that she had chosen to do it anyway because she wanted her sister removed from her life. She had understood the wrongness of her actions well enough to attempt to conceal them, well enough to research how to avoid detection, well enough to rehearse stories and maintain composure during interrogation. The understanding was present. The capacity was demonstrated. The choice had been made with knowledge of what that choice would accomplish. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression reflecting the weight of what he was hearing, that a 12-year-old girl had the capacity to understand right and wrong, and had deliberately chosen wrong anyway. The judge himself questioned the state psychologist about the possibility of remorse, about whether Alexandria had shown any genuine understanding of the harm she had caused, or any authentic desire for redemption or change. The psychologist explained that in her evaluations, Alexandria had shown no signs of genuine remorse. She had expressed frustration at being caught, annoyance at the disruption to her life, but no authentic grief about her sister's death or understanding of the harm she had inflicted. When directly asked if she would do it again, given the opportunity, Alexandria had stated that she would if necessary, that she simply wouldn't get caught next time. This wasn't the response of a child experiencing moral awakening or psychological growth. This was the response of someone who had committed murder and saw the only problem with that murder as being caught rather than having committed it. The courtroom understood that the judge's question was significant, that he was seeking psychological grounds for mercy that the psychologist's testimony suggested simply didn't exist. The jury had been deliberating for 6 hours when word came that they had reached a decision. 6 hours wasn't a long deliberation period in complex murder trials, but in this case, everyone understood that the jurors hadn't needed extensive time to determine guilt. The evidence had been so overwhelming, so comprehensively documented, so impossible to dispute, that the deliberation period had likely been consumed not with determining whether Alexandria was guilty, but rather with discussing how they felt about convicting a 12-year-old girl of first-degree murder. The courtroom filled rapidly as word spread that a verdict was imminent. Reporters who had been waiting in the hallways rushed back to their seats. The parents of the victim made their way to the courtroom, understanding that this moment would represent some form of culmination, though not closure. Closure was something they would never experience. This was simply the moment when the legal system would formally acknowledge what everyone already knew, that Alexandria had deliberately poisoned her twin sister, and that justice would now determine her punishment. Alexandria was brought into the courtroom from the detention area, sitting at the defense table with her attorney beside her. She showed no visible anxiety about the verdict that was about to be announced. She wore a pale blue dress, the same color she had worn on the first day of trial, her hair neatly arranged, her appearance composed. She looked like a schoolgirl attending a class presentation rather than a defendant about to potentially receive a life sentence. The judge entered and took his position at the bench. He asked the bailiff to bring in the jury, and 12 people filed into the courtroom, their faces reflecting the weight of what they were about to do. Several looked directly at Alexandria as they took their seats, their eyes conveying something between pity and horror. The expression of people who were about to deliver a verdict that would end childhood as a meaningful category in her life. The judge asked if the jury had reached a verdict, and the foreperson stood, a middle-aged man whose face appeared strained, whose hand seemed unsteady as he held the verdict form. He was asked to read the verdict on the charge of first-degree murder. His voice was barely audible as he stated the word that hung in the courtroom like a physical presence: guilty. The single word was repeated for each count: guilty, guilty, guilty. The charges had multiple counts, multiple opportunities for the jury to find her not guilty on at least one, but the verdict was consistent across every count: guilty on all charges. The victim's family released a sound that was something between a sob and a gasp, their faces reflecting a mixture of emotions too complex to categorize. Some relief that the verdict aligned with the evidence, some grief that a verdict couldn't bring their daughter back, some horror at what had been done to them, to their family, to their understanding of what the world contained. Alexandria's reaction was the most striking element of the moment. She didn't cry. She didn't appear shocked or devastated. She exhaled slowly, almost as if she had been holding her breath and was now releasing it. Her expression shifted barely perceptibly, but what seemed to emerge was something approaching annoyance, as if she had received disappointing news rather than a verdict that would define the rest of her existence. She turned slightly toward her attorney and whispered something, her demeanor suggesting a student who had received a grade lower than expected but was already moving on mentally to the next concern. The courtroom absorbed her reaction with a kind of stunned silence. Even those who believed firmly that she should be convicted, even those who thought the evidence clearly demonstrated guilt, seemed affected by the complete absence of any normal emotional response to being found guilty of murdering her twin sister. The judge asked if the jury was polled, allowing each juror to be asked individually whether they agreed with the verdict. One by one, they affirmed their decision. 12 people confirming that they believed beyond reasonable doubt that a 12-year-old girl had deliberately poisoned her 14-year-old identical twin sister with premeditation and malice aforethought. The polling took time, each juror given the opportunity to reconsider, to change their vote if they had doubts. None of them did. The consistency was crushing in its completeness. There was no disagreement, no hung jury, no minority voices suggesting that guilt hadn't been proven beyond reasonable doubt. Just 12 people, after hours of deliberation, confirming that they were certain of Alexandria's guilt. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks hence, allowing time for presentence investigations and sentencing memoranda from both the prosecution and defense. He adjourned the court with a single strike of his gavel, and the sound echoed through the courtroom like a punctuation mark that was simultaneously beginning and ending something. The victim's parents collapsed into each other in the gallery, their bodies shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious grief. Alexandria was led from the courtroom by bailiffs, her demeanor unchanged, her expression still suggesting mild annoyance rather than the understanding that she had just been convicted of a crime that would likely imprison her for the remainder of her natural life. The reporters rushed toward the attorneys, seeking comments, seeking some articulation of what everyone had just witnessed. But there were no adequate words. A 12-year-old girl had been found guilty of murdering her twin sister, and the courtroom fell into a silence so complete that it seemed to swallow every sound, every breath, every acknowledgement of the tragedy that was still unfolding. The courthouse had been designed to accommodate a few hundred people in its galleries. But on the day of sentencing, nearly 1,000 individuals attempted to gain access to witness what everyone understood would be a historic moment. The case had captured national attention in ways that transcended typical true crime coverage. This was about childhood, about criminal responsibility, about the definition of justice when the perpetrator was 12 years old. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse. Security barriers had been erected to manage the crowds. The judge had ordered enhanced security measures, understanding that the emotional stakes of this moment were extraordinarily high. Court officers kept careful watch over the galleries, aware that the victim's family, Alexandria's family, and a diverse collection of activists and observers with competing perspectives on juvenile justice were all present in the same enclosed space, all waiting for a single moment that would define how this tragedy concluded. The courtroom filled slowly, each seat taken with the understanding that what was about to unfold would be preserved in memory, would be discussed and analyzed for years afterward. Alexandria sat at the defense table wearing the same pale blue dress she had worn throughout trial, her appearance as composed as it had been on every previous day. Her parents sat several rows behind the defense table, the father staring straight ahead with the expression of someone who had learned how to function in a state of permanent devastation. The mother looked toward her surviving daughter occasionally, her face reflecting something that couldn't be easily categorized. Grief, confusion, maternal love, still operative despite everything that had happened. Guilt that she couldn't protect one daughter from the other. The victim's family occupied the front row of the gallery, their presence a constant reminder of who this case was ultimately about, whose absence had created the void that this entire legal proceeding was designed to acknowledge. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose. He took his position at the bench with the bearing of someone who understood the weight of what he was about to do. He had presided over hundreds of cases throughout his career, but this one was different. He was about to sentence a child, a girl who hadn't yet experienced the full breadth of human life, to a sentence that would almost certainly consume the entirety of that life. He began by reviewing the verdict, confirming the jury's findings of guilt, acknowledging that the evidence had been overwhelming and that the jury had acted with appropriate deliberation. He then opened the floor to victim impact statements, giving the family of the deceased an opportunity to speak about who Maya had been and what her loss meant. The father stood first, his body moving slowly as if each motion required conscious effort. He described his daughter with the love of a parent who would never see her grow into an adult, never attend her graduation, never walk her down an aisle, never hold the grandchildren she would never have. He talked about her kindness, her gentleness, her dreams of becoming a teacher. He described the emptiness of the house now that she was gone, the way certain rooms felt impossible to enter because they were too full of her absence. His voice broke multiple times as he spoke, and the courtroom sat in silence, allowing his grief to occupy the space completely. He looked directly at Alexandria as he concluded his statement, and for a moment there seemed to be a question in his eyes, whether his surviving daughter's daughter could understand what she had taken from him, whether she could comprehend the father he would never be to Maya, the grandparent he would never become because of her deliberate choice. The mother stood next, and her statement was less about articulating grief and more about attempting to describe something that had no adequate language. She spoke about the bond between twins, about how Maya and Alexandria had been connected from birth in ways that transcended normal sibling relationships. She spoke about the betrayal of having that bond weaponized, of having the closeness that should have been protective become the mechanism of murder. She described the moment she understood that her surviving daughter had deliberately poisoned her other daughter, the moment when maternal love became complicated by the understanding that the child she was supposed to protect was also the child who had destroyed her family. Her voice carried not just grief, but a kind of existential confusion, the sound of someone trying to maintain love for a child while acknowledging that child's capacity for profound harm. The defense attorney stood to present mitigating factors, attempting to construct an argument for mercy despite the overwhelming evidence of guilt. She spoke about Alexandria's age, about the neurological limitations of a 12-year-old brain, about the possibility for rehabilitation and change. She argued that a life sentence without parole was disproportionate, that it denied the possibility of the defendant ever becoming something other than what she had been on the night of the poisoning. She presented psychiatric evaluations suggesting that Alexandria's pathological traits might be amenable to treatment, that with proper intervention she might develop empathy and understanding of the harm she had caused. It was a coherent argument, legally sound, presented by an attorney who genuinely believed in the possibility of redemption even in the most terrible circumstances. But the argument seemed to hang in the courtroom without gaining traction, without finding purchase against the weight of evidence that suggested Alexandria had acted with complete understanding of what she was doing. The judge sat silently for a long moment before speaking, his hands folded in front of him on the bench, his eyes fixed on Alexandria. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, understanding that what was about to unfold would be the culmination of everything that had preceded it. The judge began by reviewing the law regarding sentencing in cases involving juvenile defendants. He acknowledged that the law recognized developmental limitations in children, that it provided mechanisms for rehabilitation and eventual release even in serious cases. He spoke about the evolution of juvenile justice, about society's understanding that children deserved different treatment than adults because their brains were still developing, because they had the potential for change, because childhood was supposed to be a period of mistakes followed by growth and redemption. His voice was measured, his tone judicial, but the weight of what he was saying began to settle over the courtroom. Then the judge's tone shifted. He looked directly at Alexandria and began addressing her, speaking to her not as a judge to a defendant, but as an adult to a child who had done something that transcended typical juvenile delinquency. He said, "You sat in that courtroom throughout this trial. You heard the evidence about what you did. You heard testimony about your sister, about who she was, about what you took from her and from your family. And you showed no emotion. You displayed no regret. You expressed no understanding of the harm you caused." His voice carried something beyond judicial authority. It carried the weight of someone attempting to communicate across a chasm of understanding, attempting to make a child comprehend what she had done. He continued, "The defense has asked this court to consider your age, to remember that you are only 12 years old, and I have considered that. I have reviewed the neuroscientific evidence about brain development. I have studied the research about rehabilitation and the possibility for change." The judge paused, and in that pause the courtroom seemed to compress all of its attention into a single focused point. He continued, "But childhood is not a shield against accountability when a child demonstrates that she understands the difference between right and wrong and chooses wrong anyway. You researched poison for months. You didn't accidentally find that information. You deliberately sought it out, studied it, refined your understanding of it. You measured the dosage with precision. You understood exactly what you were doing when you prepared that drink. Most significantly, you understood that poison causes death. You didn't research poison because you were curious about chemistry. You researched poison because you wanted your sister dead, and you wanted to accomplish that goal without anyone knowing you had done it." The judge's voice grew firmer, more authoritative, as he articulated the central moral reality that had been obscured by discussions of brain development and rehabilitation potential. The state is seeking life without parole. The defense argues that this is too severe a sentence for a child. But the evidence demonstrates that you are not a typical child. You are a child who understood death. You are a child who understood that poisoning someone would cause them to die. And you did it anyway. You did it because your sister was in your way, because you resented her existence, because you decided that eliminating her was preferable to living alongside her. That is not the impulsive action of a child overwhelmed by emotion. That is the calculated decision of someone who understood the consequences and proceeded anyway. The judge began articulating the sentencing decision, his words carrying the finality that only judicial authority could convey. He spoke about deterrence, about the message that society needed to send regarding the taking of human life. He spoke about the victim, about Maya's right to have lived her life free from the threat of her twin sister's calculated violence. He spoke about the parents, about their right to have raised two daughters without one of them deliberately murdering the other. He spoke about the principle that when someone took another's life deliberately and with planning, when they did so with full understanding of what they were doing, the consequence had to be proportional to the severity of that action. His voice remained steady, professional, but the content of what he was saying seemed to crack open the entire courtroom. Then the judge delivered the sentence. "I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You will spend the remainder of your natural life incarcerated. You will not be released at 18 or 21 or any other age. You will not have the opportunity to experience freedom again. You will not leave prison except in death." The words fell into the courtroom like stones, each one landing with weight, each one final and absolute. For the first time throughout the entire proceedings, Alexandria's composed expression fractured. Her eyes widened. Her hands, which had remained folded throughout the trial, suddenly gripped the edge of the defense table. Her mouth opened as if she wanted to speak, but had no words. The judge's sentence had finally penetrated whatever psychological defense mechanism had allowed her to sit through months of trial, maintaining complete emotional distance from the proceedings. The courtroom erupted. The victim's family released sounds that were between sobs and gasps. Some observers nodded their heads in acknowledgment of what they believed was justice. Others put their faces in their hands, unable to process the reality that a child, an actual child, had just been sentenced to die in prison. The judge banged his gavel once, commanding silence, and the courtroom quieted, but remained electrically charged with emotion. Alexandria sat frozen, her hands still gripping the table, her face finally displaying the fear and understanding that had been absent throughout the trial. She had finally comprehended that the consequence of her calculation was not temporary detention, but the permanent erasure of her freedom, the permanent truncation of her life. Childhood had ended, not at the moment of sentencing, but at the moment she had decided to poison her sister. The court had simply confirmed what she had already made inevitable. 3 weeks after the sentencing, the parents visited the cemetery on a Thursday afternoon when the autumn sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the rows of headstones. Maya's grave was marked with a simple stone bearing her name, her birth date, and her death date. 2 numbers separated by a dash that represented the entirety of her 14 years on earth. The mother placed flowers against the stone, white roses that seemed too fragile for the permanence of death. The father stood beside her silently, his hand resting on her shoulder, both of them understanding that this visit, like all visits to come, would be fundamentally incomplete. They were visiting alone. The third member of their family who might have stood at this grave was now incarcerated in a maximum security facility, beginning what would be a lifetime sentence of confinement. One daughter had been murdered by her twin sister. The other daughter would spend her remaining years in prison. The family had been fractured in ways that no counseling or therapy or passage of time could fully repair. The community that surrounded the suburban neighborhood where this tragedy had occurred was divided in complex ways that defied simple categorization. Some residents believed firmly that Alexandria deserved the life sentence, that her crime had been so calculated and so cruel that only the maximum punishment was appropriate. These people nodded when discussing the verdict, spoke about justice being served, believed that the judge had made the only possible decision given the evidence. But other residents struggled with a more complicated emotional landscape. They had watched a 12-year-old girl be sentenced to die in prison, and regardless of what she had done, they found themselves questioning whether that was the kind of society they wanted to live in, whether the punishment fit the age, whether there was any possibility that a child's brain might eventually develop the capacity for empathy and remorse that had been absent during the trial. The community remained fractured along these philosophical fault lines, united in their horror at what had happened, but divided about whether the judicial response had been just or whether it represented something darker than justice. Legal scholars across the nation began publishing analyses of the case, debating its implications for juvenile justice law and the definition of accountability in children. Some argued that the case demonstrated the necessity of trying certain juvenile offenders as adults when the crime showed such sophistication and planning. Others contended that the sentencing represented a troubling erosion of protections designed to account for developmental limitations in children, that it set a precedent that could lead to harsher treatment of other juvenile offenders, that it reflected a failure of society to address the psychological problems that could lead a 12-year-old to murder her sister. Law review articles were written. Appellate arguments were prepared. The case became a touchstone in discussions about whether rehabilitation was possible for children who had committed horrific crimes, whether age was truly a factor that should influence sentencing, or whether it should be irrelevant in the face of sufficient malice. The judge agreed to one interview several months after the sentencing, speaking to a legal commentator about his decision to impose the life sentence. He explained his reasoning methodically, addressing the arguments that had been made about brain development and rehabilitation potential. He acknowledged that these were legitimate concerns, that research supported the idea that adolescent brains continued developing into adulthood. But he articulated what he believed to be a fundamental legal principle, that when someone deliberately took another person's life with full understanding of what they were doing, when they did so with planning and premeditation, the consequences had to reflect the severity of that action. He said, justice must acknowledge both the nature of the crime and the capacity of the perpetrator to understand what they were doing. This defendant understood the difference between right and wrong. She understood that poison causes death. She understood that administering poison to her sister would likely result in her sister's death. She made that choice anyway. Those facts don't change because she was 12 years old. The parents struggled through the months following the sentencing with a kind of grief so layered and complex that it seemed to defy language. They had lost one daughter to death and one daughter to imprisonment. They were required by law to decide whether they wanted to maintain contact with their surviving daughter, whether they wanted to visit her in prison, whether they wanted to continue a relationship with the child who had murdered their other child. The mother visited periodically, maintaining a connection that she felt obligated to preserve, despite the devastation that Alexandria had caused. She brought photographs, books, updates about the world outside the prison walls. Alexandria received these visits with politeness, but without genuine engagement, her affect remaining as flat and emotionally distant as it had been throughout the trial. The father could not bring himself to visit. His grief for Maya was too intertwined with his confusion about Alexandria, his inability to reconcile the child he had raised with the person who had murdered her sister. The bedroom remained untouched for months after the sentencing. The twin beds still stood in their original positions. The posters on Maya's wall remained where she had hung them. The books she had been reading sat on her nightstand, bookmarks placed in pages she would never read again. The mother couldn't decide whether to preserve the room as a memorial or to clean it out and return it to some state of normalcy that would never actually exist. Eventually, she cleaned it slowly, removing Maya's belongings and boxing them for storage. Keeping certain items, a favorite sweater, a journal, a photograph, to preserve the memory of a daughter who had deserved so much more than 14 years of life. Alexandria's side of the room was gradually dismantled as well, her possessions removed to storage, her space erased. The empty room became a physical manifestation of what had been lost. Not just Maya, but the twin bond itself, the relationship between two identical girls that should have lasted a lifetime, but had been severed by deliberate poisoning. Justice had been served in the way the law defined it. The perpetrator of a crime had been convicted and sentenced according to legal procedure. But the cost of that justice extended far beyond the courtroom. A mother had lost one daughter and watched another daughter be locked away forever. A father had been forced to contemplate how he had raised a child capable of murder. A family had been destroyed not by accident or tragedy, but by deliberate choice made by someone who shared a genetic code with the victim. The community had been reminded that evil could wear the face of a 12-year-old girl, that darkness could live in a suburban home, that the assumption of childhood innocence could be violated in ways that left permanent scars. Justice was served, but innocence had been buried twice, once in a grave and once in a prison cell, and neither burial would ever feel like resolution. If you believe justice was served in this case, make sure others see this story too. Share it. Discuss it. Let it remind you that the pursuit of accountability sometimes requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about what children are capable of when they choose darkness over light. Subscribe to stay with us as we continue exploring the cases that challenge our understanding of justice, responsibility, and the human capacity for both cruelty and redemption. Thank you for witnessing this story with us.